يسرني أن أعلن وبصفة رسمية باسم الحكومة، باسم مجلس الثورة والحكومة، أنه ابتداء من اليوم قررنا باش ناخذ 51% من الشركات البترولية الفرنسية. هذه القرارات اللي كنت أنوي الإعلان عليها باسم مجلس الثورة وباسم الحكومة وباسم الشعب الجزائري بهذه المناسبة.
A young President Gaddafi, Boumedienne's Libyan neighbour, was a die-hard revolutionary, touched by the Algerian question. He had been only 31 when he seized power from King Idris in a military coup in September 1969. He had inherited oil from the king and wanted to use it as a driving force for his revolution. But he needed to control the American independent companies who had been taking advantage of Libya's monarchy for the past 10 years. American companies had operated in the country since the 1950s. In 1962, Libya had joined OPEC and soon became one of its largest producers. At that time, the Libyan realm was an oil paradise for American independent companies, and the Idris regime all too easily corrupted. Everything changed when Gaddafi came to power in 1969. In 1970, he created a national oil company to control domestic distribution and signed a cooperation agreement with the USSR. The American oilmen realized what was in store for them, that Gaddafi wouldn't hesitate to withdraw their concessions. Following Boumedienne's advice, Gaddafi met each of the managers of the American companies in turn to negotiate a price for crude. In the Tripoli Agreement of April 2, 1971, against all odds, Gaddafi, backed by OPEC, was granted a 30% record increase in the price of oil per barrel. In 1972, 1 year after Gaddafi's victory, it was Iraq's turn to catch the fever of oil nationalism. The country was ruled by the Ba'ath Party, whose dream was to unite pan-Arabism and socialism. The Iraq Petroleum Company, that had been founded 50 years earlier under the British protectorate, was now in decline. It had already suffered defeat when General Qassem created a republic, ending the monarchy installed by the British. In 1965, Qassem retaliated against the Iraq Petroleum Company by taking away 99.5% of its concession, leaving them only already exploited zones. 7 years later, in 1972, Saddam Hussein, the man who defeated him and took his place, led the last fight for nationalism. Although he was only vice president at the time, he held the power. Like his colleagues, Boumedienne and Gaddafi, Saddam Hussein was still young and inexperienced. Nevertheless, he was already a feared strategist and a cunning politician. Before taking any action, he wanted to be sure the USSR would support him, and so he went on a state visit to the Kremlin. The Soviets were happy to snatch Iraq from Western influence and assured Hussein of their full support for his plan. They also offered him the technical assistance he required. In June 1972, comforted by this promise, Iraq imposed the nationalization of IPC. British and American oil magnates were ejected and soon replaced by Soviets. And so in barely 16 months, 3 OPEC members had managed to shake the major's total power. This situation would become increasingly problematic for industrial countries who were becoming dependent on OPEC for their oil. 1 year later, the Yom Kippur War would trigger what was to become the first oil crisis. The region was fast becoming a powder keg. This episode examines how in the 1970s, the member countries of OPEC, that had been created 10 years before, came to understand the value of oil as a fearsome weapon against the West. At that time, OPEC represented about 50% of world production, a fact that placed a great deal of pressure not only on the majors, whose hegemonic power had remained largely intact until then, but also on the industrial countries who increasingly depended on OPEC for oil. But the winds of protest didn't only blow from OPEC members with revolutionary ideas, like Algeria and Libya, but also from more conservative member states, and one-time allies of the United States, like Saudi Arabia and Iran. They had a common objective: to better their oil income by increasing the price of a barrel. The price rocketed so regularly during the next 10 years that the members of OPEC believed that they had at last become the new masters of black gold. Once again, it was war that was to be at the heart of these times. On the afternoon of October the 6th, 1973, Egypt and Syria, backed by Jordan, launched an attack on Israel. Egyptian troops crossed the Suez Canal, and the Fourth Arab-Israeli War had begun. The attack came as a surprise to Israel, and all the more since it was Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. Egyptian forces advanced and pushed back the Israeli defense line that lay 15 kilometers beyond. Although a local war, what became known as the Yom Kippur War triggered the greatest upheaval in the history of oil. It started in 1967, when Arab nationalism was exacerbated by the Israeli occupation of Palestinian territories following the Six-Day War. President Anwar el-Sadat, who succeeded Nasser, wished he could liberate them. He understood the battle had to be led on both the military and the economic field of war, using oil as a weapon. First, he gained the support of King Faisal of Saudi Arabia, a fierce enemy of Israel and the leader of the greatest oil power in the region. In 1972, King Faisal, on a visit to President Nixon, warned the US government to change their stance towards the Palestinian question or risk serious economic retaliation, and by this he meant oil. Arab nationalism was nurtured by the Palestinian cause and the OPEC members' claims. It happened in the shadow of a deep change in the international monetary system, which had been the exclusive domain of the dollar until then. The system had been established following an Allied meeting at Bretton Woods in the United States after World War II. At that time, the US had reached the height of its power, possessed 2/3 of the world's gold reserves, and the dollar became the currency for international trade. The US solemnly promised to guarantee the dollar with gold. But everything changed at the beginning of the 1960s. The number of dollar banknotes in issue outside the United States exceeded their value in American gold reserves and could no longer be guaranteed. And so in 1971, as the situation became critical, President Nixon broke America's promise and abandoned the system, allowing the dollar to float and be devalued. OPEC member countries were the first to suffer from the devaluation, as oil had always been traded in dollars. With such conditions, even the smallest of events could push OPEC into action.